One of Europe's most weirdly wonderful languages is in trouble. You've probably never heard of it, but if you can speak English, you can understand an awful lot of it.
Oh, there's some nice bread. You fancy that? Con aceite de tomate?
It is a glorious mix of English and Spanish, and it only exists here, in Gibraltar. With the help of some locals, let me explain to you what it is and why it's worth saving.
I thought my language was not being protected, so I had to stand up and do something about it.
Welcome to another Rob Words. Gibraltar is a British overseas territory dangling off the bottom of Spain, hence the red phone boxes, the red pillar boxes and the Union flags that you'll see flying around the place. English has been the official language of Gibraltar ever since the British arrived here back in 1713, even though back then no one here spoke it except for British service personnel, basically. People were speaking a variety of different Spanish dialects and Genoese, who were the biggest group here. But over the past 3 centuries, English has now taken hold, and because of educational reforms, pretty much everyone here speaks it. However, what has also developed is a unique version of Spanish called Llanito. Yanito is a special variety of Andalusian Spanish, which is slightly different to the Spanish that's being taught in schools all around the world. That's Castilian Spanish. But unlike Andalusian dialects in Spain, Yanito is crammed full of English vocabulary, as well as words from languages that have been historically present on the rock, like the ones I already mentioned, but also Hebrew, Maltese, Portuguese. But the English words really stand out.
I'll give you an example that most Gibraltarians can relate to. You're in the UK, you're in London, in a shop, and suddenly you hear somebody speaking, "Mum, ¿te gusta el dress? Ay, no sé. Shall I buy it?" You just know it's Yanito.
That's Davina. She's a Yanito speaker and works for Gibraltar Cultural Services, and part of her job is promoting Yanito.
For me, it's the language of the heart. A certain love and passion that's reflected in that language that's kind of like unique and particular to us Gibraltarians. If I were now to be speaking to a friend, I'd be like, "Me voy a comprar un café. Would you like something? Ay, not quite sure lo que me voy a pedir hoy." It could go something like that.
I've also been speaking to Dale and Manuel, who are both Yanito speakers too, and also hoping to secure its future.
It was important for me to promote my own language, something which is quite unknown. There's not that much information out there, so it's important to get that so that the world can see it.
When do you speak Yanito?
Mainly with people closest to me, family, friends, maybe a little less so with my children, because the younger generations are increasingly speaking English rather than Yanito or Spanish.
I think the English words that have made it into Yanito speak to the unique coming together of cultures here. For example, I love the fact that Yanito has the word keki for cake instead of a Spanish alternative. You can also sit down for a drink rather than una bebida, and perhaps have a pint de cerveza, a pint of beer. But there are loads of other English-inspired words.
The word for licorice, in Spanish, it's regalí. In Gibraltar, we say liquirva, and it comes from the licorice licking bar.
English is, of course, the language of education. It's the language of government. It's the language of professionalism. And that's reflected in the borrowed words, too.
For example, tiche, which is a teacher, nes, which is a nurse, bus, which is a bus, raba, which is a rubber.
That's distinctly British English rubber
Yes.
as well, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
I know in America they wouldn't call it a rubber.
Yeah. Printa, scanner, all technical terms will come from English.
And then there's also the phenomenon of Spanish words that have had their meanings changed to fit their English relatives. Manuel explains this much better than I could.
The Yanito word for the operating theatre is el teatro. The Spanish word is quirófano, completely different. So we would say entrado en el teatro for somebody who's gone into the operating theatre, whereas a Spaniard might understand that as he's gone to the theatre to see a show. In fact, I've heard of people having misunderstandings in Spain.
We'll get deeper into Yanito and the threat it's facing in a second. But as I mentioned, many Gibraltarians are proud British citizens. However, the UK's decision to leave the European Union has obviously had an outsized impact on them. In fact, at time of recording, the governments of Spain, the EU, the UK and Gibraltar still haven't agreed on things like where customs checks should take place now and who should carry them out. However, finally, a deal seems close. And I've been able to follow all sides of the debate using this video's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is an app and website that gathers news articles from around the world and allows you to compare coverage to get the full picture. In the case of the Gibraltar talks, you can see how over 20 articles covered the latest developments, both in the UK and the EU. But there's little coverage on the right wing, with right-wing sources preferring generally not to talk about Brexit these days. You'll see some articles say the parties are within kissing distance of a deal, while others just say they've made significant progress. Now, I've worked with Ground News a few times before now because I really like what they do, and in a big year for elections like this, it has never been more important to get multiple perspectives on any story and to understand their biases. Plus, with the Vantage plan that I have, you get access to the blind spot feed, where you can see news articles that are under or over reported, so you can discover stories that you may be missing. So see through the headlines and stay fully informed. Go to ground.news/robwords or use this QR code to get 40% off unlimited access to Ground News. Back to Yanito. Yanito also contains all these words that conform to English grammatical rules, like the English gerund form, our words ending with ing, pop up in Yanito, despite that definitely not being a thing in Spanish. Just have a listen to Dale here.
I'm a teacher, so my conversations with other teachers might be tengo que ser printing este document, tengo que ser printing el exam, tengo que ser marking esto.
Plus, Yanito's speech tends to be peppered with English cliches too, like come on or well or anyway. Although I think for moments of real emotion, they tend to opt for the Spanish. It just hits harder. Now, if you're watching this in, say, the southwestern United States or in Puerto Rico, you might have been screaming at your screen so far, just saying, Rob, we have this too, it's Spanglish or whatever. And I see what you're saying, but it's not the same. In fact, at one point I used the word Spanglish here to describe Yanito, and it did not go down well. While a lot of what's going on the other side of the Atlantic is essentially all about code switching, so flipping back and forth between Spanish and English, often mid-sentence, Yanito is different. Because in Yanito there is code switching, sure, but there are also many English words that are essential. They have replaced the Spanish alternatives. That's not code switching. Another notable thing about Yanito is that it sometimes uses the English construction of a sentence rather than the Spanish. An example that a lot of Gibraltarians have given me is that they would say te llamo patra for I'll call you back. It's more English than Spanish.
You say te llamo patra, you don't need to say patra, you just say te llamo, that means I'll call you. It's just that I think we're doing it from I'll call you back.
So far we've only been talking about English words entering Spanish, but obviously there's been some traffic the other way round, right? English has been borrowing Spanish words for centuries. For example, we took the word siesta from Spain to describe the Iberian habit of having a nap in the afternoon. And remember that a fair chunk of the USA used to be Mexico, and other parts were Spanish colonies, plus the USA is on Central America's doorstep. Hence, a whole host of, for example, US states and US cities have Spanish names, and in these areas, Spanish words have flooded into English. We have the word buckaroo as an alternative to cowboy, which is from the Spanish word for cowboy, vaquero. Ranch is from Spanish, and rodeo is pretty obviously from Spanish. Then there are features of the landscape as well, like canyon, and weather, like tornado. And by the way, tornado's windy opposite, the gentle breeze, is also from Spanish, but that transfer happened in Europe a few centuries earlier. Oh, and how about animals? The alligator, something the British never needed a name for until they found themselves in Florida, gets its name from Spanish el lagarto, the lizard. When English adventurer Walter Raleigh talks about them, he actually refers to them as the crocodiles, now called alligartos. And this is all to say nothing of how we've gorged ourselves on words for delicious Spanish and Mexican delights like fajitas, burritos, tortillas, and salsa. This Spanish influence on food vocab is more acute in the United States than it is in other Englishes. For example, American English uses cilantro from Spanish, where British English uses coriander from French. Both words, by the way, do come from the same Latin word, coleandrum. But this borrowing from Spanish can't really be seen as a direct counterpoint to Spanglishers or Yanito. However, really recently, linguists declared that they'd identified a new dialect of English that has some unusual grammatical features taken from Spanish. They called it Miami English because it's spoken in Miami. Many of the words and phrases that appear peculiar to that city in southern Florida are a result of the high level of immigration from Spanish-speaking countries. For example, folk in Miami can be heard referring to beef as simply meat, or instead of saying, I got out of the car, they might say, I got down from the car. These formulations will be familiar to speakers of Spanish. Pretty cool, eh? But let's get back to Llanito, because Dale and Manuel are so worried about the potential loss of this, to the outsider at least, really quirky way of speaking. That's why in the past couple of years they formed Gibraltarians for a Multilingual Society, an organisation aimed at preventing English being the only language of Gibraltar.
It's always been a multilingual society, yet we are now heading towards monolingualism. It's quite the contrary of what's happening around the rest of the world.
As a teacher, someone who works as a teacher, as a linguist, I thought my language was not being protected, so I had to stand up and do something about it, and that's what we do.
So why is Yanito under threat? Well, the same educational reforms that made English the dominant language here at times discouraged and even punished the use of Yanito. As a result, a whole generation or more felt actively discouraged from teaching their children Spanish or Yanito. And with languages, if you don't use it, you lose it.
It's been that insistence on English being so important that very little importance has been given to Yanito. It's almost like we've taken it for granted. I feel very much it's been taken for granted, and nobody really has stopped to think about it until now.
Certainly, I think something that most people would agree is that Yanito is being lost with the younger generations. Although there's also a drive and a want and a desire to make sure that, we keep it alive.
I spoke briefly to a linguist from the UK who is in Gibraltar studying Yanito. She was adamant that there is a class thing going on here. I put that idea to Manuel.
Yes, obviously, English has always been the language of the elite. We go back to the colonial days. It was obviously the language of the colonial masters, and anybody who wanted to be close to the colonial masters would be speaking English and trying to imitate, as has happened in other parts of the British Empire. So yes, it has had that connotation. Not anymore, I would say. I think with younger people, it's no longer the case. It is the norm. English is now the norm.
So how do you go about saving Yanito? Well, you need to get new people speaking it, right? And a good way is to start with young people. Now, Yanito hasn't traditionally had a written form. There have been attempts to make one, but it's really existed as a thing that people use to speak to one another, not write down. But now you are starting to see more books coming out written in Yanito, and in particular, children's books. This one that Davina's showing me is supposed to explain Yanito to kids, but it also works pretty well for lanky English YouTubers too.
Oh no, the pavana has taken my patatas. That's quite a common occurrence, so the seagull has taken his crisps. And then what? Are you even Yanita? Let me take you around Gibraltar. Vamonos, let's go. So it's really good fun.
Actually, work to preserve Yanito has really kicked up a gear just recently, and people like Davina, Manuel and Dale are really dedicated to saving it. So I suppose the question you have to ask is why?
I always have a huge problem when people ask me, what's your mother tongue? Because it's not English and it's not Spanish. It can only be Yanito. That is my mother tongue.
It's so intrinsically linked with who we are as a people, with our identity, and that's something that Gibraltarians are very proud of.
Yanito is a language which is unique to Gibraltar, and if you want to find out about Gibraltar's history and learn about Gibraltar's history, Yanito is the gateway to that.
It strikes me that it would be a shame for Yanito to be lost. It represents a unique coming together of a unique set of languages in a unique part of the world, and I think it deserves some love. Thanks for watching this video. It was a bit different, wasn't it? The algorithm reckons you should watch this one next, and I reckon you should sign up to my free newsletter by going to this address here. Thanks to the people of Gibraltar for being so welcoming. Thanks to my pal Martin, who has been holding the camera, and thanks to you for watching. I'll see you in whatever you choose to watch next. Cheerio.
Whoop.